This is a map of the world.
The world.
When Western leaders like US President Biden or UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak talk about the international community, what do they really mean? Their so-called international community is really just a small minority of mostly European and English-speaking countries like the ones shown in yellow on this map. But Western leaders and mainstream media present them as the international community. This is propaganda. But it's not just the mainstream Western media and politicians who think like this. Here is a video clip from the left-leaning independent U.S. news program Democracy Now!, hosted by Amy Goodman. Here she is interviewing Andrew Bacevich about the war in Ukraine.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're joined now by Andrew Bacevich. His most recent pieces include one headlined, U.S. Can't Absolve Itself of Responsibility for Putin's Ukraine Invasion. The response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been staggering.
I think your point is basically correct. The negative response that Putin has elicited across around the world, not everywhere, but most places around the world, has been astonishing and heartening.
What is staggering and astonishing to me is that these two people, as do most Americans, believe that most countries around the world have joined with the U.S. to condemn and sanction Russia. But as you can see from these maps, this is just not true. 37 countries have put sanctions on Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. The UN has 193 member countries. Western mainstream media would have you believe that the entire world is against Russia, but 37 out of 193 UN member nations is just 20% of the total UN membership. That is hardly the entire world or even the international community. In fact, over 80% of the real international community haven't put sanctions on Russia, and some of them are even calling for the lifting of some of those sanctions. And at the most recent summit of the G20 nations, the UK's current Prime Minister said, quote, "This morning at the G20 summit, we saw international condemnation of Russia's war in Ukraine," close quote. True, the G20 nations come from around the world, so I guess you could say they are international. But this, too, is propaganda. The G20 nations are barely 11% of the world's nations. Further, only 10 of the G20 nations have put sanctions on Russia. So this is the Western mainstream media's delusion of what the international community looks like. These are the countries that count to the Western world. But if you get your news and information only from mainstream sources from these yellow countries, you get a very limited and one-sided story, as South African journalist Johan Allers explains.
I have to say to you that I'm approaching this discussion with there's a sense of frustration about the single-minded, or rather the one-sided narrative about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which we are, at least in the Western media, being confronted with on a daily basis. You know the story. The conflict is relentlessly being described as an unprovoked invasion by Russia. And yes, Vladimir Putin is the devil himself. He is the Adolf Hitler of our time, and he is a madman hell-bent on restoring the might of Russia. That's the narrative. This is not true, and you know that, and I know that.
John Pilger is an Australian old-school journalist and documentary filmmaker in the UK. Here's what he said in a recent interview with Yandan Latu on the South China Morning Post's show Talking Post about Western mainstream media's Ukraine reporting.
Yes, you must remember, though, that above all, this is a war of propaganda. And I would think almost nothing one reads in the Western press about the invasion of Ukraine is to be trusted, because nothing can be believed. The propaganda operation in Ukraine is quite brilliant.
Even being a member of the mainstream media myself, I have to agree with you to a great extent there because of the disproportionate coverage in this war. It's reached a stage where anything that the Ukrainians do is glorified and anything that the Russians do is vilified.
Well, I've spent my career working in the mainstream, and I've covered probably 7, 8, 9 shooting wars. The mainstream media is part of a propaganda war, and we must be skeptical. We must be skeptical of absolutely everything.
Here's journalist Jeffrey Sachs in a recent interview commenting on Western MSM's coverage of Russia.
What we hear from the rhetoric in our mainstream media in the United States is, well, Putin is a Hitler, and he has to be stopped, and we have to defeat him. There's no talking to him. The man is crazed, living in a dream world of Russian imperialism. I can tell you, since I'm an old guy now, 67, I've lived through this characterization every decade. There's a new Hitler that we can't deal with, whether it was Ho Chi Minh or whether it was Vietnam or whether it was Cambodia or Laos or Nicaragua, for heaven's sake, or Iraq or Syria. We are real good at this game of rhetoric, but this is not real. And since I am all over the world, virtually all the time, speaking with world leaders, what we hear in our media is propaganda. It is not real.
Be sure to share this video, subscribe to my channel, click on like, and watch part 2. Be sure to watch part 2.